Hey everyone, Raleigh Carter here, and with my long time, you have so many titles in my relationship over the years.
Yeah, multiple titles, and at this point, I don't know what you
Just my
consider them.
friend
Yeah,
who does a lot of gymnastics with me. This is a conversation about the gymnastics framework that I've been working on over the last 7 years. Cooper has contributed a lot to it, and we're going to just be diving into exactly what all those pieces are and what it looks like in a practical sense of your daily coaching needs. Do you want to introduce yourself at all, Cooper?
yeah. So, name is Cooper Bishop. I was or really the first athlete of Raleigh way back in the day. I want to say 13 years ago. At this point, we had amazing first season when I was training level 5. We took like all around every single meet that we went to. And then we decided to go level 8, and terrible idea. So many mistakes. Got injured. Trying to flip vaults after doing a front tuck, and then trying to do a souk the year after. So that was an interesting journey. Kind of gym hopped for a little bit, and still dealt with injuries. Kind of a lack of a baseline for gymnastics, so there wasn't a lot for me to build on other than my natural intuition of my body awareness and what I knew would work. So kind of struggled up through level 10 when I did finally have to quit at 17 due to injuries, and then also just the dynamics for men's gymnastics is when you turn 18, you usually have to either go to college or start joining a club. And so I did have to make the decision at that point to be done with my gymnastics career. And now I'm working with Raleigh. I've been working coaching for him for 8 years this June. So
It's a long time.
yeah, started rec, and now I've been teaching competitive for, I want to say, about 5 years now.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Cool. So I figure what I'm going to do is, like we always do in our conversations, I'm going to run the outline and you can fill in the details, and then people can kind of see how this dynamic works.
Absolutely.
And go from there. So the framework that I'm terming it, if you didn't know that, Cooper, now I'm calling it the gymnastics framework.
Okay. Let me know when you're on the third iteration.
Yeah,
So,
I will.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just give you, the audience, an outline of what the framework entails, and then we'll just hit it one step at a time. So the framework is basically the idea of where do I need to place my energy, and how do I need to allocate time according to the type of energy that I am using or performing or chasing after. And so the categories that we're pursuing after, and how we've kind of chopped up the effort into these compartments, is there you have shaping. Shaping is, Cooper and I are still in the process of defining this to its most smallest particle. But you have shaping, then you would have basics. Then from basics, you'd have fundamentals. That term has had many iterations. We've called it core skills. We've called it essentials. We called it other names, but I'm right now sticking with fundamentals. So then you go from basics to fundamentals. Fundamentals will take you into upgrades, or would we go to routines first? Probably upgrades, and then you go to routines.
Depends on how you're trying to relay the story. In an actual training week, we would usually start with routines, and routines go into your upgrades. But of course, you have to have your fundamentals. You have to have some sort of upgrades.
True. Right.
Prior to even having a routine.
So you got this routine and you got this upgrade relationship. They're again their own two training modules, and then you would have what we are terming as your elite skills. And we're just putting the label elite skills as in the hardest skill you can do and what's going to push your timeline as far forwards as possible. And so just by attaching the word elite, it kind of gives us a vision of where it's trying to go. So we're not trying to hold anything back. So just running through that again, you got your shapes, your basics, your fundamentals, your upgrades, your routines, and your elite skills. And so that's how we're breaking up the type of effort that we're pursuing. Inside of each one of those, the effort is then being measured based off of certain categories. So example would be basics is we're chasing quality. Fundamentals, we're chasing dynamics and amplitude. Upgrades, we're chasing A+ grading so that it's good enough to put in a competitive field, and then it also earns consistency. So we're chasing a grade plus consistency so that we know we're ready to progress in difficulty of the skill. hence the word upgrades. Routines, we're chasing the wow factor. All we're just trying to do is feel this emotional change inside us when we're watching, where it's basically you're pursuing that effortless performance that creates this wow experience for the observer. And then elite skills is basically chasing max effort, huck and chuck, hope and pray, go all out till you black out essentially, and just hope you live. Like, how far can you push yourself in the safest way possible with the least amount of damage happening to your body? And so that's kind of a very subtle nuance and is going to take more to unravel in that category of how to do it safely and appropriately for the long term. Did I explain that pretty decently?
Yeah, I think that covers all the what are we calling them now? Categories or?
Yeah, categories, training
Yeah.
categories. Anything I need to add before we move on to the next thought?
No, I don't think so. I think that
That's good.
covers everything. Mm-hmm.
All right, so starting with shapes, we haven't fully hashed out how we want to do shapes in the sense of our training, but we do have an idea of, I think, the pursuit of shapes, and that is connecting the idea of a position to a word to create awareness in the athlete to better improve the conversation between the coach and the athlete. You want to expand on any of that, of why you think that might be important, the hurdles or the things that we've been trying to do with shaping, and we've always just run into these types of roadblocks that get in our way, and why we would want to define that even more?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the trickiest things with gymnastics, especially when you're crossing over gym to gym, but even within gyms, is being very specific with your words so that the kids will always understand the meaning. And that could be as simple as the word round, and what does round mean to you versus to me, and then what does the athlete think round means? Because there can be some huge misconceptions if I say the word round and I'm looking for a core position, right? Just the upper torso. Or if I say round and I'm talking about the backswing on high bar and I want the entire body shape to be round, right? So being able to eliminate as much of those confusions as possible is just significantly going to improve your communication skills from both coach to coach and then athlete to athlete, because we want to get the result as soon as possible and just eliminate any of those confusions. So an example I will usually see is if I'm doing like a fly spring, and if I tell an athlete to freeze and show me round, and if you've ever done this as a coach, you've probably seen they don't really round as much as they possibly could. And what we want to train is that if we're saying a shape, you're going to show me the absolute most version of that the word accurately describes, right? Straight. It's like you're going to show me exactly straight. I don't need to see extra round or your head up, down, anything like that. It's like, no, I just want everything neutral, straight, as much as you can possibly be. So that's kind of where we're going with being able to define those words and make them very specific so the communication gets cleaner all around.
Yeah, I like how you explain that. I think I know for me personally, the frustration came from, and anytime I have to repeat myself like more than a couple times, I'm just like, I put a halt to the whole thing, and I'm just like, okay, this is what I said, this is what it means, until we all understand this, we're not moving on, because I'm not going to keep having this conversation over and over again. And I think from that, I'm just like, okay, we need to nail down what do words actually mean with the positions that we're trying to hit, and not have any tolerance for any deviation, to be like, no, it's exactly this position. I don't want, like you just described, like round can mean so many different things. I don't want a soft round versus a hard round, and both are an option. It's like, no, there's only one that's an option, and that's what we're in pursuit of.
Exactly.
Especially, I think, too, when you're talking about, like, when we're dealing with generating power, because everyone's body type is a little bit different too. Sometimes shapes need to be applied differently for the speed of the athlete and the size of the athlete. And so when we use simple terms like arch and round, it's not clean enough in helping the athlete understand how much they need to arch and how much they need to round to benefit in order to generate the necessary power, X, Y, and Z, right? That's usually where we get hung up on, is we tell a person to round, they don't round enough, and we're like, well, you're not generating enough power. There's not enough round in the story in your shape change to actually produce power. And then you're spending all your time convincing them they're not round enough to produce more power, and they're thinking, no, I'm fast enough. And it's this game of how do I prove to you what I'm saying is true?
Yeah. I think that part of the story could kind of lead into the why we have broken down our program into so many pieces, and part of it is to kind of eliminate that problem so that we always know specifically when am I going to be asking the athlete for this concept, as well as when are we just focused on training the shapes versus generating the power, and how are we going to almost just test the athlete consistently to say, yes, it is enough, and you'll be able to tell, not just the coach saying, hey, I think that one was good enough. It's like the athlete should be able to know, oh, I was successful because this was able to happen.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you want to dive that to yet or just keep with the shaping conversation, but I think it naturally is going to lean itself into talking about the whole.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's perfect. Let's move into basics. So basics took us, I think I find the conversation of basics kind of humorous because one, the term basics is kind of thrown around where people think they understand like, oh, we have these complexes or these basic movements, and then everyone's creating their own form of what basics look like. And it's just kind of like this general term. And even when we were building these categories out, I kind of like blew over basics as if it like wasn't super important. Like, oh yeah, I got this figured out. And then like we almost finished everything else. And when we came back to basics, we got like, wait, how do we define this? And what is this? And we realized like there was so much more to be understood with what are we actually chasing in basics. And just going into, I think if you could give at least the audience some of the story of like when you were teaching basics, when I would give you like, okay, Cooper, you're going to go to beam and you're going to do basics. And you're sitting there going, but what do I measure? And then you're like trying to measure the athletes accurately, but it's like so chaotic. If you can kind of like run down, here's the problems with basics without nailing it down. Like before we nailed it down, what was the problem?
Ooh, okay. So the problem with the basics is you're usually trying to train something that you don't want to have the conversation for later when they have to put it into the routines. And so it would be a lot like there'd be so much potentially to cover that one, we didn't know, well, what is super, super important. So let's just do kind of the most base layer of things that might apply. And then two, I think the format that we were using didn't really lend itself to producing the accuracy needed, right?
Yeah.
We would do like, hey, you have numbers and then you're going to show me. But the problem is you can't have a athlete do a high volume of numbers during basics that are wrong and hit one that's better because they're showing you, and it's still not good enough because then you have to repeat that, right? So how much time are you going to waste when it's like, hey, go work on this? So I think the solution to that was changing the format so everything that they're doing is always visible, and that was a big help to that. And then the other thing was we started creating, or at least defining, basics as a skill that could have a rhythm at the highest accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
And then I believe there was another way that we defined it versus some of the dynamics and amplitude. Remember what we talked about in that, Raleigh?
Yeah, you actually pointed out the fact that because we agreed upon that, like I like how you just described it at the very beginning. We wanted basics to be something where we would never have to come back to that conversation. It's something that you just do it right, and we can build off of it. And so because we knew that that's what we wanted, but then the way we were measuring it was not producing that outcome, we knew that, okay, we need to be pursuing quality to the highest degree, especially because we have a learning problem where athletes don't seem to learn quality and keep it with them over time. And we also identified that even if I get quality in a certain skill, it doesn't always cross over to another skill. The quality doesn't always transfer. Sometimes we have to remind people to keep the quality up. And so we wanted to use basics to drive that quality, but then we had that time problem. And I think you came up with this idea because we were on the phone discussing it, where you said something along the lines of like, we wanted quality over time or quality for time. It's like the endurance of quality. And so we realized, like, it's not just I want quality, which was the original problem. Do numbers, show me if it looks good, and we'd only see it once look good. And we're like, okay, you passed, but the other numbers were all garbage.
Yeah.
And so we're like, wait, that doesn't make us have quality over time. And so we know that if a person is consistent, they can correlate. And that's the biggest thing we saw when we were correlating power, is if an athlete can consistently generate power, it's so much easier to correlate that power to other skills. But with quality, we didn't have quality over time, so we weren't seeing the correlation of it happen over all the other events, essentially. So for us, it was quality for time and trying to create the time range to be as close to what is going to be required in a routine. Because however long your routine is basically how long your quality needs to be.
Yep.
So it's like, can you maintain quality for the length of your routine, doing something, whatever that basic is, and using that as a form of measurement.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we decided when selecting the skills for basics, because you could look at something like bars and say, okay, a back hip circle is a basic skill because it's a low-level skill, and it, at least starts some sort of building blocks into more skills. And we didn't want the basics to be skills necessarily that would just linear progress. We wanted them to be a skill that you were just always going to need to work on. And so while that does scale somewhat, it's turned into more things like your split jump. Well, you just always need to have a powerful split jump. Your casts on bars. Okay, you always need to have a powerful clean cast because that is going to show up in every single level.
Right. It never goes away.
Yeah, same thing. We do head springs, and technically you could probably build head springs into a layout or something like that. But the head spring, as far as the shape change goes, is used for all front tumbling.
Right.
And so that's kind of where we went with basics. Standing back handsprings with the correct shape changes, hurdle positions for, round offs, cartwheels are going to carry those through always. I think beam is the only one that needs to probably be further defined. Right now, it's mostly kind of your releve work, your turning, your ability to hold your leg up, which would just kind of help correlate to the split jumps. And then we have some tumbling basics in there as well. But that's kind of where the theme came from, is what do you need to always carry through your gymnastics, and you don't necessarily need to focus on upgrading it in the moment. It just needs to be A+ perfect every time you go and show it.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I like how you brought that point in, because I remember sitting there having that conversation with you going, Cooper, I figured out why people are so far behind on bars because the starting point is not the same starting point like it is on floor. Like level 3 floor it starts at back handsprings, and then you go to bars and it's like, well, what's the thing you need? And it's like a cast, a handstand, and a kip, and it's like that bars doesn't start there.
No,
like,
it's twice the level.
Yeah,
to even get to the starting point.
So that's why you have such a deficiency on bars. So just like you said, basics needs to have these cornerstone skills that carry through all the levels and have value through all the levels, because that's the quality that you're building into those skills that you're going to then see crossover and correlate through all the events, essentially. Okay, so I think that does a pretty decent job of helping people understand how we view basics. I want to put in a quick thing, because we didn't put this at the beginning of the talk, is the idea that this is a framework, which means people can kind of pick and choose a little bit on what they want their basics to be, or how they want to manipulate and mold the whole story. But understanding why we're measuring things the way we are and how we're lumping skills together, I think that's really where the value is. So you don't have to use necessarily what we define as our basic skills. You could add more or take away depending on your timeline or what, how many days or hours a week essentially you're training. Yeah,
maybe you have a class of all higher level athletes, so their basics are at this point harder skills than A's and B's on each of them. So that might very well be the case at some point, even in our program. If we grow a group of higher level athletes, the basics might evolve and change over time.
Yeah, but we're sticking to those core principles essentially. Okay, so then we get into the fundamentals, which created a split in the story because we had dynamics and amplitude. Now, background is we knew that whipping mattered, and we knew that double flipping mattered. And then obviously we knew that twisting was important. But for the power, we started, you kind of brought up the point, like originally, if a person can back whip and front whip essentially consecutively, making connections happen on a tumble track, let's just say, then they're just tumbling is just significantly improved. And there's not a lot more that has to be dealt with other than just getting better at it. And so we started with what we called core skills, and it was all about front whips and back whips and connective tumbling. But then we ran into a problem where we realized that while we were getting better traveling linear or horizontally in generating power and momentum, there also needed to be a change in amplitude. And then we were trying to solve the amplitude problem in other categories, and it seemed more like that fundamentals is what kind of got born out of it, is that we have this horizontal energy and we have this vertical energy, and we need to separate them in the story and say we need to get better at horizontal and we need to get better at vertical, because then they'll correlate when they smash together in other categories essentially. Anything you want to add to that thought?
Yeah, this was, I think, for me, a personal frustration for a while. Just, again, kind of coming from the background of, I figured out how to make myself go upwards pretty early on in the story of gymnastics, and we had a lot of athletes that were very low tumbling, just for a couple of years, I believe, there. And what we were prioritizing was kind of more similar to the story of J.O., get a clean double back handspring. And then you ask the question, well, how do you transition from that to back layouts and twisting? And well, you don't. You have to actually change the story if you want to get into harder level gymnastics. And so you're right, exactly what you said. We knew that when an athlete could whip consecutively, but it wasn't even just consecutively. When an athlete could do whips forward and backwards, accelerating, we knew that they could move their bodies and to do it aggressively enough to then produce the power for harder level skills. But they didn't learn how to change their direction. So the shape change they were doing was almost always the same, right? It was just throw hard arch, throw into a hollow or a piked hollow. And so then the question had to come up, like, well, how do we get an athlete to go up at some point? That is a lot more complicated than whipping. So I personally still enjoy the story of, hey, just learn how to whip as fast as you possibly can, because I know that athlete will have the aggressiveness to do double flipping much sooner than an athlete who always tumbles at their own tempo. And I think that's where you run into a lot of the dangers for any program, is when an athlete has only tumbled at a certain tempo and you need more energy for them to do a harder level skill. Well, now you're relying on strength, you're relying on the speed of the athlete, the durability of the athlete, and a timeline of, well, when are they going to get stronger? Versus we need to actually push you first, and let's do it in a safe scenario, right? Do it on mats, do it on a track, do it somewhere where your body's going to be able to handle it. But you need to learn how to go as hard as you possibly can, and the best way to do that is either triple back handsprings as fast as possible or whipping. And so I still think that's the starting point for the story. And
just real fast, the thing I liked so much about the whipping and your observation of it is because we also, by watching power tumblers, realized that we need to start from a higher position and drop down into the surface to change direction and get the max amount of energy to push us back up. And so when we only did back handspring tumbling, we never were able to create the nuance of how to drop into a surface. And the multiple whipping allowed us to actually get athletes to understand what it meant to fall into a surface for that change of direction. And so I feel like once we got athletes who could whip into double backs off of a tumble track or whip into layouts, they really felt how to take something that was high and drop it down into a surface and then change direction. I felt like it was an easier aha moment than yelling at the person who's back handspringing essentially and being like, as you would do, like, don't put any weight on your hands and bend your arms and stop putting weight on your arms. And they're like, I don't understand what you're saying.
Yeah, they'd just be so baffled to be like, why would I bend my elbows in a back handspring? It just feels weird. We'd have athletes like freak out when they tried to do a back handspring that would drop downwards out of it.
Yeah, and they just couldn't feel
how
it.
You tumble. What do you mean? This is like, you have to do that. But you get an athlete that can whip and change, right? Because the faster you go in a whip, the lower it has to be. So eventually, you at least learn how to adjust your height as well. But that does bring it into amplitude. it's really all about, for us, how do you get low, or how do you make the surface move the most, and then how do you get to straight at that loaded position so that your body can handle the impact.
Right.
And there's more to the story. You could talk about angles and your alignment and stuff like that, but the simpleness of it would be get into the surface, get to straight, and load it as much as you're capable of. And when you can do that very efficiently, you're going to go up. And that's just changed a lot of the conversation.
Yeah, because your conversation a lot of times with the girls would just be like, just get straight. And I remember I thought it was kind of funny when you went to a camp with me, and there was a gentleman who's a high-level vault coach and Olympic-level vault coach. I'm not going to drop names, but you go over to him and you're like, so where does, I think it was like, what is punch or something like that?
Yeah, he's talking about, I believe there's two different coaches, but there was one that was saying feel the punch, and then there was another one that was saying get to straight on the punch. Right? But that didn't tell me enough information, because I didn't know what he meant by on the punch. And that sounds so obvious. It's
right.
What you're about to bring up is it's actually at the bottom. Right? It's
Yeah.
not when you start hitting the surface. It's not necessarily on the way up. It's specifically at the very bottom, when that bar or the trampoline or the floor has reached that point. And that's so key for the rest of what we developed, because that tells you how does your body need to move, how quickly does your body need to move, depending on how much the surface moves.
Right.
And that's changed, again, a lot of the conversation.
And so I want to go back with because this transition point of how do I transition from horizontal to vertical has so many nuances. And I think in the gymnastics community, there's a lot of debate on it, because people want to talk about perfect technique or quality of shape. And when you get into that side of the conversation, we know that there's a loss of power that comes into play. Like, it's really hard to master perfect technique and perfect shape and then be like, yeah, but I'm going to convert energy the best way possible, essentially. Yeah. And so we talked about mentioning bent arms in the back handspring, and I can just think about, like, there's probably people out there going like, I would never bend my arms in a back handspring.
Yeah,
like, why would...
or legs. Right?
Sure,
That's
right.
a big debate. Even though a lot of people just are okay with bent legs in their back handsprings, and we're fine with it too, because you see it at all levels. There's some gyms that do straight leg back handsprings, and I wouldn't knock them off for that, but it's not necessarily a part of the story that really should be debated. It's what is going to create the most amount of energy.
So I just want you to kind of, I think it'd be great if you could explain why bending your arms in a back handspring is so important to learn, even if you're not going to use it, even if it goes against your philosophy and you're like, hey, I'm never going to have my kids do bent arm back handsprings. What is the value that it brings to the story?
So when you're doing consecutive back handsprings, or even just round off back handspring, and you're tumbling at a rhythm that pushes down the surface always the same amount, you're always going to get that same amount back. So you might do 2-3 back handsprings, and we know that your hands and your feet are always going to have a similar amount of pressure on them each time that they touch the surface, and that creates a direction that is always traveling backwards. And so what you brought up a little bit earlier, a lot of times I will tell people is you need to have lighter contact on the hands, and what that does is it increases the pressure into your feet. The reason for that is you bend your elbows, you're going to learn how to lower your center of mass, and you need to lower your center of mass especially on surfaces that move significantly. So you go to like a springboard or something. Fortunately, a springboard is up, right? So you don't have to usually bend your elbows much into a springboard, but the top of that springboard is not where you're actually going to be punching.
Right, it's not the bottom.
Yeah, so maybe tumble track would probably be a better example. I can push a tumble track down, or some of our athletes can push a tumble track down in 1.5 feet.
Right.
So that's where you're trying to get your center to finish. Your hips, they should be sinking about 1.5 feet lower than if you were to just be standing on that tumble track.
Yeah.
And the only few ways to do that are you need to bend your arms as you pass over them in order to get your hips to lower there, or you almost have to fully skip over your arms. So you can have straight elbows, but you need to rotate so hard that your hands are, or that you're almost really doing a whip with just a brief hand contact. And you can look at this in power tumblers, in Olympic level athletes, and anyone that's going to be doing harder than double flips, I guarantee they have a very light hand contact on the ground, and all of the energy from the throw of their back handspring, the arch phase of the back handspring, is going to be directed downwards. And then they're going to have to hit the floor and stand up really, really fast in order to convert that downward energy back into upwards. And so the bent elbows, it's good for awareness, but you need to know how to move your center.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the biggest point, I would say. If you're going to learn how to work with a surface, learn how to move your center.
I really like how you explain that. So then I want to transition into, okay, so we have this, why I should learn why I should do bent elbows, which is drop my center of mass. Depends on what surface I'm on and how far that surface moves, which I also think is a cool tool. I tend to lean on it a lot in building awareness in an athlete, because there's the speed at which the athlete moves, and then there's the speed at which the surface moves. And I usually try to tell them how much that surface is supposed to move in distance, so they can better understand how they're supposed to move either faster or slower to get that surface to move. Example would be sometimes an athlete moves almost too fast on the tumble track that they never allow it time to actually drop. And you're just like, hey, chill out and put more down pressure in the story, and stop trying to get over everything so fast, because it's not even pressing the surface down. And the reason why I try to I chase this conversation is because I feel like the athletes who become more aware rely more on the surface and less on themselves to do the gymnastics. But the athletes who are kind of lost in la la land, they tend to try to force everything themselves, almost like they're afraid of the surface to even do any of the work. And they usually are quicker to be like, I'm just going to make this thing happen. And they don't get a lot of surface response. And the danger I see in that, and this is where I'm going to segue into, is how people are loading the surface. Originally, when I was going through my coaching development, everyone's talking about being round in the finishing positions of a back handspring, and then all of a sudden I hear people start talking about piking and pike downs, and I'm like, well, that's not correct. It needs to be round, because that's what I was taught. And then I started investigating this pike down and seeing it show up more in the elite world and the harder level gymnastics. And it got me thinking, wondering, why does a pike down matter? Because we know we're still trying to find a straight position. And the best solution that I can come up with, and you can tell me what your thoughts are on this, but I know we've talked about it, is the pike down. So as I'm dropping my center of mass into the surface, the pike down allows me to gradually load my body as it's hitting the surface, versus hitting it as straight as possible. Now I'm striking the surface while I'm being straight, and that load is hitting my body at the same time, which is while I'm traveling the surface down. So it's very abrupt. It's very damaging on the body, especially on Achilles and ankles and feet and stuff. But if I pike down, I can still push the surface down, and then I can, as I'm standing up, load the surface even more as I'm standing up, and it gradually, the force is gradually loaded into my body, so that it's not this, it's like striking action, if that makes sense. It's more of a pushing, standing action.
Yeah.
And that seems like it's a very nuanced thing, but I see that the athletes who can do it, it's almost like there's this delay. They push the surface down, they stand up, there's this delay, and the surface is like, oh, I've been fully loaded, and then it's like, boom, take off, and the person just gets launched.
Yeah, and you'll see that on tumble track more significant, because you just have a greater amount of time for that surface to load all the way. So it's where you see the people almost having their head on the ground while their feet are still pushing down into the tumble track, and they're going to stand up it almost looks delayed. It's like they stop rotating for a second, and then all of a sudden, kapow, they stand up really, really fast.
Yeah.
So we know I agree with what you said as far as the pike into and then getting to straight afterwards. Because we know that there's really 3 ways that we can lift our body or just jump. We just want to keep it as basic as jumping.
Okay.
You can push through your toes, you can straighten your knees, or you can open your hips. Really, it's just anything that is making you shorter, then that gets to longer. So we want to use every mechanic that we can that allows us to move enough to get short and then get as tall as possible. I've seen a few athletes that would bend less, and I could definitely see the damage problem that could come along with that if they especially don't get the core position on the front side, you're almost always loading the back in a slightly arched position. And we don't at all want that. So learning how to do a rounded pike is usually how I'd want to describe it, is going to be much more beneficial for the loading of the surface. But either way, just efficiency wise, right? We're trying to get to a smaller shape, and then as the surface allows, increase that shape back to straight. And you're going to see it less on floor than you would on rod floor, and you're going to see it more on tumble track than you're going to see anywhere else. But that concept is always going to apply. It even applies on bars quite often, and that's the funny one, because that thing only moves an inch or so. But you still see, right, the whole body has got to close, whether you're doing a clear hip or really any other skills. Most of the other ones come from a pike, so that makes it a little bit easier to see. But even clear hips tend to have this rounded or even closed hip angle that people need to shoot open from, or at least the very powerful ones do. So that allows the shaposhing action, even the hips come up even more aggressively. So, yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, so then anything we need to cover in amplitude? Well, okay, so people who are listening, for those coaches that are listening, I want to just break down our fundamentals and how they cross over to events, because bars is a funny one. So what would fundamentals look like on bars? But I think why not just start on floor, because we basically know that for us, our philosophy is that floor basically makes us better vaulters. And so we get really good at this whipping action, and then we just cross it over into vault land. But beam, what are we doing with fundamentals on beam?
Beam is a little bit weird. I feel like you have two categories that are really easy because they do progress so far on beam, and it doesn't change the story of what we've already talked about very much. You basically have connected series, so double, triple back handsprings would be ideal, but back handspring step outs, and that's going to be your dynamics, your linear travel, and then you're going to have amplitude, which is it's really a round off back layout or standing back handspring 2 foot finish and a layout out of that. But it's anything that can travel upwards. So it can turn into punch fronts. It could turn into standing flipping, stuff like that. But the story is going to stay the same. It's going to be move that way, and then it's going to be go upwards.
And then on beam, basically the progression is we're usually doing dismounts for amplitude because the athletes are not capable of doing amplitude on the beam. Yeah. But essentially once they become ready, then amplitude would be tumbling that goes up onto the beam.
Correct.
And staying on the beam. Okay, so then bars, I think that, and then what we have dance, what are we doing for dance dynamics for amplitude? Or are we just sticking with tumbling mostly in the fundamentals realm?
As far as fundamentals go, I believe we have kept it on the tumbling side. There might be one instance where we do have a dynamics for split jump work, but I believe mostly categorically it's everything that can translate floor to beam to vault, tumbling wise. What was the other question you're going to ask there?
And I was going to transition into bars. What does bars fundamentals look like?
Yeah, so bars is going to be circling connected, so being able to create a rhythm, and this is very difficult. So we do use straps pretty frequently. You're trying to get something that can either stay at the same rhythm or slowly increase in size. So can they start small? Can they get it bigger? Because that's really what acceleration would normally be when you go to track. On bars, it has to go up. There's no other real direction for it to go. You could drop harder, but then you're going to overshoot your finish. So it has to slowly travel upwards. And then we would have the other side of it, which is going to be like your undershoots, your actual clear up to handstands. But it's really, again, building for Shaposhes or for Tkachevs. And you kind of same thing on a high bar. Any tap swing work you can rhythm, whether that's like you're trying to back up rise undershoot rep, or you're doing baby giant undershoot reps from a tap, even just normal tap swings as big as you can. It could all technically be under that category of dynamics with rhythm. And then high flyaways, or you could even say a like really drills for double backs would be more the amplitude side of it. So that all kind of plays nicely because it allows you to say, hey, we have a layout flyaway, but how are we ever going to do a double back? Well, obviously you have to put giants before it. So Now the categories kind of link more linearly to how you would need to progress through a level. And we're not just going to say, oh, go chuck a double back. It's like, no, you kind of need giants. That's important. You need to round up a handspring to throw a double back, or at least a good round off.
Right.
So.
Right. So so they're still playing nicely together.
Yeah.
And nothing super isolated from itself. Okay, then I think that covers that. So then when we get to the next category, we could just talk about, I think, upgrades. And how do upgrades I feel are pretty straightforward. But I feel like talking about how you go about applying the principles in with your group, and how do you decide if someone's ready to move on? How do you hold people back? Where are you starting in the process of what an upgrade should start, where it should start in the story, and those pieces?
No, I think that's super important to go over upgrades, because this, we have struggled with when to do these in the past, or I know a lot of gyms will have this kid didn't get their skill, or the parents complaining about, my kid didn't have time to work this skill, so now they're not ready, and it's not the athlete's fault. And we kind of just cut straight through that and said, hey, we're going to give you an opportunity to upgrade on a regular basis, and we're going to have it in the schedule, right? However long we're going to give you every event. And the only thing is, you have to show me an A to an A+ competitive skill at your current level. So if you're not going to show me the prior progression, you get to go and move on, right? You need to be performing it for me, or at least showing the effort that's like, yeah, that is so easily upgradable. There's no reason for you to not do it.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is we don't do we do upgrades for a couple of reasons, but in the competitive world, you should be doing upgrades because you're competitive. You shouldn't be doing upgrades because you want to throw a harder skill at an athlete. Just sounds like it's exciting. We've had a girl who really wanted to throw double flipping before, and we're like, you don't tumble correctly. It's not safe. You don't have the power for it. Unless you fix this thing, we're not going to have you do that. And we'll cut that story pretty short, but that's kind of the decision now we're making on a regular basis, to say, you got to give me it
right
at the absolute best that you can correctly, and then we'll allow you to have that extra time.
And I think I've liked about that is now it puts the responsibility on the athlete, and it takes the responsibility off of us. And I feel like one thing we've done with trying to build this framework is put a lot of the responsibilities on the athlete now, so that the parent doesn't have room to come to us and say we're not helping them, or it's our fault on the reason why the athlete is not progressing. Because now we can say, no, we've spent time, we've allocated time towards basics, we've allocated time towards fundamentals, we've allocated time towards upgrades, and this is what your athletes or your daughter's performance looks like within these spots, and this is the reason why they're not progressing.
Yeah, we can give very specific reasons for that now too, that are, we're waiting for them to take ownership of these corrections for whatever reason. It's a quality or it's a technical problem. And, since we do see them every day, if that person isn't getting to upgrades pretty regularly, it does show that they're behind, or they aren't actually making the corrections that they should. So it's been much more straightforward. And I think it's been good. All of our athletes are usually excited for upgrades. One, because they get to prove themselves that they're competitive in the sense of, scoring even when they go to competition. And then two, it's led category by category,
right?
But it changes up pretty often. So it kind of gives you this freedom on the athlete side to be like, oh, wow, I get to work on this skill that either I wasn't expecting, or like I wanted to a week ago and I wasn't able to, but now I am.
Right.
And so it's kind of freeing in that sense.
I'm going to put some backstory for you coaches that are listening, because we train 16 hours a week, and with that it creates time constraints, and yet we want to fit in all our categories. And so it's taken some creativity on my part to try to figure out how I want to cycle through the information. And one thing that we've been testing out, and as Cooper's feedback is just right now, is what we've been doing is we broke the upgrades into 4 categories, basically. We have front tumbling, back tumbling, we have leaps, jumps, and then we have turns, essentially, right?
Correct.
And what we're doing is we're just basically having week 1, 2, 3, 4, essentially, and each category gets its own week, and then they cycle through the month. But because we have a beam and we have a floor, we've basically balanced it out so that they're always going to at least be getting a dance element and then a tumbling element, then a dance element throughout the weeks, so they're not imbalanced through the process. While they might be working on front tumbling on week 1 on floor, they'll be working on some sort of dance element on beam on week 1. Then when they come to week 2, they might be doing some back tumbling on beam and doing some dance on floor. But in the end, it's all going to cross over, because what we've really dive deep into is the ability for an athlete to correlate what they're getting better at. And so while yes, they might not touch front tumbling and upgrade land on floor more than once a month, they're able to correlate through the entire program. We don't see a decrease or a deficiency show up in front tumbling on floor because we're catching it in fundamentals through the basics. They're still doing routines, so they still have to apply it. So we're not overloading the system. We're trusting the system with the correlation, and we're staying really sensitive to the balance of the things. And so the thing I like what Cooper just brought up is, because there's variety now, the athletes aren't necessarily able to memorize the entire schedule emotionally and actually feel it out, versus when you have this constant schedule, you can kind of go through these emotional highs and lows, because the athlete's like, I've emotionally gone through this journey like so many times, and they're just not motivated anymore. And so the coaches oftentimes have to ask for like, how can I switch it up and how can I create more energy in my group? But by us cycling through categories, what that does is it changed the emotional effort throughout the weeks. So the athlete is never going through the same emotional journey. Thus, they don't get kind of stuck into a rut. And it pulls out the best of them, and then it gives them things to struggle on, and then it gives them things to overcome. And it's this constant journey that is constantly shifting and changing for their benefit, essentially.
That basically covers that. Just touching on what you said right before with how our schedule is designed, and that they're touching upgrades once a month they're touching the upgrades once a month, but really there is more opportunity throughout the weeks usually for them to allow it to show up more than once, in the sense of they get done with their routine time early. Well, we would allow them to go into upgrades. Mm-hmm. Their dynamics are going to quite often correlate to whatever their upgrades are. So they have a layout on track. Might as well twist it, right? If it's already at where we need it to move, how we need it to move, they're going to be working on twisting, and they might be working on handspring fulls on floor. Great, now it's gonna show up on track. So there is this nice, like, hey, you're building it everywhere, but when upgrade time comes, this is like the real deal. Do you have it, and can you put it into the actual routine? Clean wise, right? How clean are you actually going to be, and on the real surface? Right.
So, that's a good point, that the upgrades do happen on the real surface, like other categories may not.
Yep.
And I'm glad you brought in the, can you put this in your routine? Because that, I felt like over the years of coaching competitive, there was never this clean spot to take the skills you learned and put them into your routine. And it felt like everything was getting smashed together, 3 months before a season started, essentially. And I know that there's a lot of history in periodization where people are peaking, and they're using this periodization process to peak at the top. But I did some research in undulating periodization, essentially, which is cycling through a process so that you never really truly peak, because you're constantly cycling through, and then you just continue moving up in like these steps. And there's really no peak except these cycles that finish, and then they start themselves over again. And so it creates these rest periods, and then it creates these high stress periods, but then it creates these rest periods again, and it just continuously elevates you, essentially. So the idea behind upgrades was like, we need to do something consistently that says, hey, have you learned something new? And it's like, if you have, the question is it good enough to put it in a routine? Mm-hmm. And then the question is like, well, if you haven't learned something new, what are you going to compete? And so then it's like constantly confronting the athlete, like, hello, we're doing this for competition reasons. We're not just doing this to goof around and have fun and play. And like, there's no consequences at all. Like, I don't have to learn new skills. Oh, wait a second, 3 months to season. Now I have to learn my new skills, because that's kind of what athletes would do, right? This constant procrastination. But with upgrades, it's like always in their face to be like, what did you learn? Mm-hmm. And then are you ready to compete it?
And during routine time, can you put it in there too? Because off season or on season, we're at least always dedicating some time to routines now. And if they have a skill that could replace or be upgraded, and I know it's been done the week before, 7 times successfully, or it's safe to put into the routine, they're going to start building that.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not making a massive change to the routine where they're not ready for the volume load, or they're having to deal with learning choreography and the endurance side of, oh, I'm tired, now I have to put it into the routine. It's like, no, it's just the same routine you did last year. That hasn't changed. You're doing a walkover instead of a handstand. And,
right, yeah.
That's it. And that has made it so much easier. We have a new group of littles who, some of them are just doing handstands fully all the way upside down on a beam. Well, we have a couple others that are able to do cartwheels. And so I had one of our girls just start adding a cartwheel into her, bronze routine. And, that's like level 4 gymnastics. And she's very close to that on beam. So we start adding those slowly as I see her hitting them all and covering them all in upgrades. She's going to have a level 4 routine, maybe even higher in a year or so.
Right.
So
yeah, that's cool. I like how that's been working, because no longer is this, we don't have to have meetings like, when is this person ready to put the skill in? It's like, did they show it was an A+ quality, and did they do it consistently? Great. Stick it in the routine now. Okay, so does that cover everything we're happy with on upgrades?
Yeah, I think so.
Upgrades are level specific skills within, and they always happen on the surface. We're not modifying the surface because we want to put it in a competition setting, and so it needs to be shown at an A+ quality on the surface you're going to compete in. Really sets that challenge out for you. So then we get into routines. Now, women's gymnastics routines are different on beam, bars, and vault, because you can oftentimes have a lot of different setups to aid in the process of doing your competition set. But you get to floor and you're like, I only have one floor. If you're one of those lucky gyms that is massive, you might have 2 floors or even 3. But most gyms are going to be dealing with 1 floor, and every single athlete's like, I want to use this floor. So I felt like originally what we were trying to do is do too many things in routine land and trying to solve too many problems, when the reality is you're not going to get that many touches, and you're not going to get that much help time, essentially, right? There's this limitation because of the space. So my background of reason why we changed routine focuses to chasing the wow factor was because I tried to change our perspective to think about, what do the judges really care about? And at the end of the day, when they're watching 360 athletes, they're going to remember the ones that give them the wow factor more than anything else. And yes, we can think about all the details and all the problems, but at the end of the day, to me, it's like, once you solve all the quality issues and the amplitude and dynamic issues, it really just comes down to who makes it pop more than the other person, because the differences are so subtle. At that point, it's like, who creates that emotional response? Who creates that lasting memory? Who's going to make the judges actually go, okay, I have no reason to take anything away, because you just elevated the competition, further than everyone else has elevated it. So that's why I think chasing the wow factor, does it make me wow? I feel like that was the best way of approaching routines because of floor. And then we just had to figure out how to cross it over to beam, bars, and vault. It seemed like bars, it was a little tricky, because floor, we can also do full routines, half routines, and we're also doing sections. But I want you to jump on that. But I just want to add in, when we went over to bars, we were like, okay, we know what full routines are. Yeah. We know what half routines are. But then we're like, what are sections? And then we're sitting there scratching our head going, a section feels a whole lot like fundamentals or like upgrades. It didn't feel much different.
We're basically doubling up on something and then realizing that there was still a problem because of connections on bars and how the event just functions in general.
So can you go into half routines and what sections are? I think everyone will understand what a full routine is. So what are those two things?
Sure. So let's just start from the smallest then. So sections, we're usually, at this point, what I've been telling the athletes is to break it into a third. If they had more skills in the routine, you could break it down even further. But we're usually dealing with athletes who have 6, maybe 7 skills in their routine. So you break it down into basically 2 skills, maybe a third one with the dance incorporated into it. And this is talking about floor and beam. And it's still not different from what Raleigh said earlier. It's like we're looking for a wow factor. And sometimes in sections, when it's such small things, it's really, can you hit them effortlessly and basically perfect, because it's 2 skills. So that's how we're usually doing sections. Now there's some variations in that, but then the problem, like Raleigh mentioned, when we head over to bars, like, well, my routine is a kip, cast, cast, tuck on, jump to bar, kip, cast again, undershoot, tap, swing, dismount, level 4. So what is a section? Well, I can't break that down into 3 sections, because then all you're doing is a kip, cast. All right, well, that's not going to require enough effort. You're going to do a tuck on, kip, cast. Well, that's not going to require enough effort either. So what in the world do you do on bars when you're thinking about sections? And then they also have the problem of how many people can actually 9-9 quality bars.
Right, yeah.
The answer to that is really only the people who are strong, overly strong for the skills that they're competing. And really only those people can 9-9. Because you don't see Olympians 9-9, right? We're talking about an 8-6 execution is really good at an elite level. So we're really doing halves on bars. And we're not even just doing halves. We're really usually doing double halves. So you're trying to get volume of connections, because being able to keep yourself moving through variety, it was more important first. And then, yes, we can add the wow, and what are you going to show me that I'm going to be like, you kept that up the entire time. That's awesome. Whether it's leg form or your shape changes or whatever, that's elbows. So usually we're doing double halves, and that's kind of what bars had to turn into.
So it was more about endurance of effort than it was about quality at the time, because there's such a deficit essentially. But keeping in mind that once the effort gets where we want it to be, then we can start demanding more of the quality. So there's kind of like this switch that has to happen.
Yeah, and with bars, I've played the game a few times with our athletes of like, what score would you want your first half to be? And they'll have to show me a double still, but like, what score would you want in it? And then I'll give them a thing of like, hey, you had this many errors, or I'll just give them a grade of like, you had maybe a 9.6 first half that time, or whatever it would be. So they get to tell me the like quality they want to actually have, and take a little bit of that. If we're not there into the 9.9, almost perfect 2 skills connected. Eventually, obviously, that gets higher, because you don't want to just say the same score every single time you come back to bars.
Right.
I still want that 8.6. And I was like, no, you don't. I'd hope not. So that's another way to kind of add the quality increase for the athletes that I've done before, is have them just be like, well, this is how good I think I can make it today. And then usually I'll be like, yeah, bump it up a little bit more than that. I think you can expect more for yourself. And use that as a motivating factor, almost like a challenge.
Yeah, that's cool.
Keep it a little bit higher. So going into halves, obviously bars, you're already doing halves, so that answers that question. Floor and beam, I actually don't think we do halves anymore.
Yeah, we cut it out, didn't we?
We cut it out. So we have still for floor and really for beam, actually, you still have doubles. So you're going through the choreography once, but you have to hit the skill twice, and we can do that. In either a section or in a half, you could do either way. But if we're looking for quality, I'm just going to keep it as sections or double sections on beam. And if I'm going for like volume, because they just need to stay on that beam, then we'll do double halves. It's not in the material.
Right.
It all depends, again, how long are the routines. Because if they're very short, no reason not to do a double half. Floor, you can't really do that on. But
I know that when we were talking about halves at some point, I asked one of my athletes, is like, what do you struggle with most on floor? And she just said like endurance and the ability to handle the endurance of, staying alive essentially through the whole process. And so part of it was like, okay, we'll do these like cardio halves, like we'll do these half routines with high cardio and get you tired while you're going through half routines or something. And I know there's like full routine options where people will just do dance throughs and lots of conditioning, or then they'll just tumble with conditioning and they'll just tumble while they're tired. But it kind of seemed like we were overcomplicating our routine time and taking away from what the end goal of a routine was supposed to be, which was the end goal is supposed to be get a perfect score. And so it's like if I'm dealing with a cardio issue, like I should be solving it outside of my routine problem.
Yeah.
Because it's more like, okay, well, if you have a cardio problem, then go run a mile as fast as you possibly can. Like, don't jog it. Like, sprint the mile and try to get down to like a 5:50 mile pace or something like that. And it's like, okay, you're going to have some good cardio. And then come in and now do your routine outside of it and make it wow, because that would be the crossover.
Yes. So I think I know the situation you're talking about is we were trying to, at some point, routines were being used as a way to get a person tired. And we both kind of looked at it and we're thinking, okay, well, if you're going to do choreography without performance, there's no point of doing choreography, right? If you're going to do tumbling, you should have some sort of purpose for the tumbling. Now, you can tumble to get tired. You could just standing backflip. You could back handspring. You could do basics. And you could even do your routine tumbling passes while tired. That's fine. But if you're going to use a full routine, which takes up the entire floor as a means to get a person tired, kind of wasting some time and also missing the intention that should be used in the whole performance side, get a 10 when you go to floor. So we currently do, I think it's once a month, because we still have cardio every week. Tumbling with some conditioning and switching back and forth between those things. But we're not going to tumble a person in a way that is going to have the expectations of, hey, this is what you're competing, or hey, this is like going to need to be perfect necessarily. I know by the fourth time we go through something like that, they're going to be very tired and the performance is obviously going to decrease. So just being intentional there with, yeah, you got to build cardio enough for a full routine.
Right.
But don't waste your time thinking that just doing routine and then getting back to your spot to do another routine right away is going to actually make your routine quality any better or cleaner.
Right, the performance isn't necessarily going to jump up.
You're going to have an alternate time to actually work on all that other stuff as well. It doesn't connect.
Well, I think that's going back to the basics category is the reason why also doing quality over time in basics has kind of complemented our routine problem, because now we do have our athletes doing split jumps with quality for time, or they're doing certain movements for time and they're getting tired while doing quality. And so you kind of have these micro exhaustions with quality happening in the basics realm, and then it compounds into being like, okay, I can actually just apply that on my routine. So now I feel like when we watch our girls do their routines, we're not seeing them half do it, because the only expectation is you better sell that routine.
Yep. And
then they're not tired because we've already prepped it essentially someplace else. We're not seeing it kind of die off. And it seems like if the only reason why it does, that the performance tends to die off, is because they're not emotionally invested in that day or in that moment.
I was going to say.
Right. And so all we have to do is kindly like basically bring it as a reminder to them. And they've all been very receptive. I don't feel like we get a lot of pushback anymore.
I remember very beginning of season, there was almost a humorous moment to me as a coach where we were at the end of the day, and I don't know why we were doing floor routines at the end of the day, to be honest. There was some scheduling error or reason. I don't know what it was. But all the girls start warming up on floor, and I'm just sitting there, and I think you're at desk or something talking with Anne. And I'm just kind of thinking, wow, I don't even know if it's worth doing routines right now. Like, their warm-up is not looking good. And I know you're looking over thinking, wow, they have so much things to fix. And I think we briefly mentioned something, or maybe you came over and you're like, hey, that better not be how it's going to be in the routines. Just a reminder. It wasn't even harsh. You were pretty nice about it. And, dude, as soon as they got into their routine work, I was like, wow, they stepped up a whole lot right there. Right? It's not actually, they weren't even close to competition season.
Right.
So for them to be able to pull that, mentally back, I was very impressed with that. And now I've barely seen that downtrend from them before
I feel like I actually remember that exact moment, because I feel like I had them all lined up by the vault cooler wall, and they were sitting there, and I remember I think I was really looking at Liana and possibly HA or somebody, and I was just like, I was basically like, okay, look at either the amount of effort you just warmed up with is all going to be for nothing, or you better make that energy actually count, because you guys all just warmed up in a way that it's like you're all going to be getting 8.5s.
Yeah.
And it's like, and I know you care, but you're just going to throw that effort in the trash can because it didn't look like anything
that is what
we've
you
been
said.
training, right?
You
Like,
said, don't you can't just go ahead, do a routine, and then waste your entire effort there.
Yeah,
Because
like,
the warm-up was not
no,
going to be beneficial to you.
No, it looked, we have kids who can get 9.5s and higher
Yeah.
on floor, and they looked like they warmed up an 8.5 routine.
Yeah.
And it was just like, wait a second. Like, I don't, and I think this is the sense of belief where I come from, is like, I know that some people just don't know when they're supposed to care. And so it's like, I know that they thought they were trying and they thought that they were doing a good job, but it wasn't to knock that. It was to say, like, okay, you put in this energy, and if you want it to matter, you're going to need to refocus your mindset, because with that mindset, that effort is not going to matter. But it's okay sometimes, like, as weird as it is people can put in bad turns. If they refocus their mindset, it's almost like they're competing against that and saying, well, did you want that to count for anything? Then you better do a better job next time, because it's like your learning lesson, essentially. Mm-hmm. It's like, are you going to learn from that? And to see the mind shift, like you're saying, like everyone to be like, oh yeah, like I actually do want something to come out of this. And they totally shifted. It was, like you're saying, it was kind of a funny, like kind of unexpected moment, because I wasn't expecting it to happen like that.
I really didn't either. I think it was great to see the whole group just decide in that moment, but like, despite how we feel, despite how we just warmed up, we're just going to perform. Yeah. Even though it's the end of the day, we're all tired.
Right. And I do remember that, like, I think Leon and a couple people were just like talking the whole group up, like, like, we're going to do this. Like, we're not going to make this count for nothing. Like, it's going to go. That's a good, I'm glad you brought that up. So then, okay, so that's routines. Then we get into elite skills. It started in some aspects. I feel like it started right when the pandemic happened and we had to shut the gym down. And then when we were able to bring team kids in slowly and we had to get them conditioned, there was this idea that I had, which I was like, I'm just going to make them conditioned so hard that they're going to just be good at gymnastics, period. Like, that's all we're going to do. And we did like 30-minute conditioning sessions straight. And then we tried to build it all the way up to where they'd condition for an hour straight, while I'd be doing various loads of intensity to manage their capacity, essentially. But the whole idea was to be like, I'm going to get you to work for an hour straight without stopping, other than taking water breaks and quick breathers. And in this, eventually we started realizing, like, wow, we can push somebody's effort. But then I think you brought up the idea, essentially, is that they just need to work as hard as they possibly can for a moment. I don't know how we came up with the term max effort. I don't know if that's what you brought to the table or what.
I don't know.
But it was something like, I just remember we were getting them to run one day, and it didn't match their conditioning. And it's like, in the conditioning realm, I saw you work harder than in your gymnastics. And that one, I had like this aha moment, like, okay, you guys are not crossing over the effort that you're putting from your conditioning into the effort that you're putting into your gymnastics. And you were, I think at the time, kind of a stickler for some, I don't know what you were being a stickler for, but you're kind of like, like whether it was all about head positions or it was all about the run and you didn't even care about something else. So then I just remember kind of feeding off of you and being like, well, it's the first step problem. Mm-hmm. And just getting them to be like, well, what's the first problem you're going to have? And they couldn't figure out what the first problem is that they're going to have. And I was like, well, it's your first step. Your first step is not powerful enough to make your second step even more powerful. And that's like, we got the athletes to learn how to take their first step as aggressively as possible. And then we saw the chain reaction happen. And then somehow in that, we started chasing max effort. And inside of that max effort, we started seeing that fears start going away, confidence started getting built. And then we started seeing that we could actually push the athletes to their limit. And then once we started pushing their athletes to their limit, we're like, oh, forcing the timeline is actually a good thing under, really safe circumstances. And because it started helping, we started noticing it was helping all the skills that were much closer to the basics land and the fundamentals. Those started improving because they were running as fast as they could in the max effort land. And then that's where we started going, okay, well, then we need to be pursuing the hardest skills in gymnastics simultaneously as mastering the basics and hitting both sides of the spectrum. That's my backstory of this whole what are elite skills, but you want to fill in any of the blanks and everything else.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. I think the thing you said it pretty well earlier. We're trying to push them into the hardest skill that they could currently do in the safest circumstance, and there had to be this kind of specific moment for that. And I think we started off almost creating as like a game. It was almost gamification. It was like, who can go over the French fry the highest type of things. It wasn't that specifically, but it was, we're going to do your Chenko, and then we're going to go up and over a block.
Okay, so I want this is exactly what you told me. Is something along the lines of, you said, Raleigh, people will not try hard enough unless there's an obstacle in the way.
Yep.
And you're like, you need to put an obstacle in the way of somebody. And I was like coming out of the mindset of, I'm going to try to get gymnastics with the least amount of obstacles possible. And you're like, unless there's an obstacle, someone is not going to try harder. Mm-hmm. So going with your French fry thing.
Yeah. And so a lot of times we know in the past, you would kind of be that obstacle, be that person who would say, hey, if this is where we're trying to go, someone should show me this. And it's become much easier because now it's just, what's the hardest thing that you can do to start with? And then we're going to just try to slowly increase that. You have a double tuck? Cool. We're trying to double pike now. And their effort just has to increase, especially because we give them such a short timeline for it that it's like they have got to learn how to turn on their adrenaline and just make something happen. Mm-hmm. And I think what was happening is exactly what you said. They weren't running, or they weren't punching, or there's something on vault. I'm pretty sure
yes,
it was
on vault, yeah.
And it was probably just everyone was running slightly slower than what they were in the past, or something that silly. But you had to solve it from the very first step. And this is where you start to get kids who are 10 years old or 9 years old. And they're throwing double backflips into the pit, and now all of a sudden that height, the energy, everything that they needed for that will correlate into their back layouts on floor.
Right.
And it, again, gets them out of that rhythm I talked about that's such a danger to be in the dynamics land, where this person just does a skill at this exact tempo or rhythm.
Right.
And, well, it's not high enough to do a double back, or it's not fast enough to do a double backflip. So why would you be okay with that as a coach? Just like, yeah, that's just how they run. That's just how fast they go. It's not until an athlete has overcome that they really have control. If you look at trampolinists, that's a fun picture to see of
how high they can go. Yeah.
You have to go to max height.
Right.
And then they have to throw a triple backflip.
Yeah.
That's an extreme.
Yeah. That's scary. It's scary to flip at your max height on a trampoline.
You're going to look at younger elite girls and check out how fast they sprint into a full twisting double tuck on floor. It's a full twisting double tuck on floor, which you get a 18-year-old gymnast who's been in the sport, well conditioned, they might be able to throw that. But you get a 14-year-old to throw that and stay healthy. It's like, no, they have to sprint.
Yeah.
They have to move real fast.
Right.
There's no holding back for that athlete. It is everything they have from the very first step.
Well, and then going into, I mean, I think just what you pointed out with just like the age, you're dealing with also a size issue. And so when we're talking about the surfaces and we talked about the fundamentals category of how to move a surface and how to get your center of mass to drop, a lighter athlete needs to create more force to get those surfaces to work for them. And so how do you create more force? Well, you need to accelerate even more because you're lighter. And so you need to hit the surface even harder in some cases. And that is a detriment over time.
Yep.
And so you get these athletes who are hitting surfaces harder because they're lighter, but they got to get the surface to move, and they're actually beating their body up, versus the longevity is when you just weigh more, the surface just moves easier, and you don't actually have to apply the same type of forces to the system. And so just as you're bringing that up, it's like it's such an interesting point, because sometimes there's a time when throwing the hardest skill is best for you, because you weigh enough. I just think about like when we take these little light kids and we're having them punch on the springboard, and you're just eat some more food, and then the springboard will just move.
It'll just be easier.
Like we just have to wait till you get heavier. We can talk about running till we're blue in the face, but it's like when you gain 20 more pounds, it's just gonna get easier on that springboard. And bars is, I think, the same thing. you get those light kids and they can't, the kipping aspect, they can't get the bar to actually move on the glide and feel the bar actually bounce and aid them in the bounce.
Yep.
Like they're using a different type of mechanic to move bars. And so going back to your elite skills point of these older kids versus these younger kids, I think that there's that longevity factor is you want to throw the hardest thing you possibly can without the detriment of throwing the hardest thing you possibly can.
Yep. Yeah. So, and that's where we're not having, I talked to Raleigh about this yesterday. We have an athlete who at probably 11 or 12, she would be able to flip Yurchenkos onto hard mats, but there's no real reason for us to be looking at that in a competitive sense and saying, yeah, go do that. Hopefully your ankles survive the next 6 years.
Right.
Doesn't mean we're not flipping Yurchenkos, but we're going to flip Yurchenkos into the pit. We're going to make the shape more difficult. Maybe we'll throw in some mats where they're squishy enough that you can make a mistake and you're still going to be safe. So we're going to push the skill difficulty in the most safe environment you can, because as soon as we are physically ready to go to the surface we compete at, they're just going to be able to do it.
Yep.
And I still haven't seen any problems with fears of the surface or anything else like that.
Right.
Because, well, one, they've already done those skills for so long.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really a big change for them. And usually we want to have this over preparedness
right.
For what we're doing.
And I like how you brought in, because that was the elite category definition, is we kind of hemmed and hawed over, should we be landing on surfaces? Should we be changing surfaces? How do we progress the elite category? And we agreed upon that the elite category should be landing on the safest surface possible so you can progress the difficulty of the skill. Mm-hmm. And so we're not focused on the landing necessarily as much as landing safely, even if that means roll to your back so you take the load off your legs. But we want to take that double tuck, turn it into a double pike, turn it into a double layout so that you're pushing the max effort part of the story, not so much focused on the success side of the story.
Yep.
And then because we've also seen that max effort, once you can push your max effort, we've seen the fear kind of disappear.
Yep.
And it's been just this huge, for me, it's been a huge relief because I don't feel like we run into fear problems anywhere close to like we used to.
Not nearly as much.
If anything, we run into more like lack of preparation problems where the athletes themselves don't feel prepared, and yet we can navigate that so much easier because we know exactly which categories they need more attention in. And so example would be like when we went to state championships last weekend, level 6, and one of our athletes was doing the Yurchenko timer and she was struggling with it. And she was feeling a sense of anxiety that she may have never felt before because she feels usually solid. The difference is that we switched her vault mid-season, and she didn't have a lot of numbers with Yurchenko timers in competition setting. And so we expected the anxiety we didn't fully anticipate the anxiety to come out, but when it did, it made sense according to how we're doing the whole entire framework, right? Because we didn't put her under enough competition settings in the routine side of things for vault. And the other side is that she needs to get better in her fundamentals to build more consistent, because we already know that she has somewhat of round off issues with making her round off go straight over the top. It's not crazy, it's not bad, it's not weird, but there's more refinement to be done. And so when the cracks started to show at competition, it's like it wasn't really that surprising. It was like, okay, we know what we need to address inside of training.
Yep.
And that's, I feel like what I've really enjoyed with having this framework is you can kind of look at the athlete and go, I know exactly where you need to get better in your training. And it's not some guessing game. It's just literally like, oh, your basics need to improve. Oh, you don't point your toe and straighten your legs in your leaps, like basics time. And oh, you don't move dynamically, or your amplitude is like weak. Like, oh, okay, we need to improve our fundamentals. Mm-hmm. And it's so much easier to negotiate that. Even when you have like athletes, I think who they might be like really good routine performers, and it's kind of like what you said earlier, is, well, they hit their routines, they got the wow factor. It's like, cool, go work on your upgrades. Like, we know that we can work on their deficits because they are excelling. We can get kids who are doing their basics and they're really good at basics. And it's like, okay, well, you got extra time because you just breezed through your basics. Like, go do some dynamics and amplitude work to improve your weaknesses, essentially. I feel like that's just helped our conversation a lot better. The other thing I like about the elite skills, just staying on that at least topic, and I'll let you add any more thoughts, is the fact that it mixes up that emotional energy in the training so much, because it really pushes an athlete to their limit, and that I feel like changes that rut that you can get in with training. Like even coaching, we're yelling point your toes, straighten your legs, we're doing all these reminders, we're working on all this technique, we're doing all this stuff, and then it's like you get to elite skills and it's kind of like this feeling of, okay, the only answer is just do a whole lot more and just go as fast as you possibly can. And then the result is usually like you just celebrate. You're just like, yay,
like, wow,
something.
that was good.
Yeah, like that's it.
That's true.
Like you're not sitting there trying to tear apart the technique. You're not trying to make the quality better. You're just like throw that thing as hard as you possibly can.
Yeah. See how high you can go.
Right.
You think you could flip more?
Right.
Cool. Go even faster. Yeah. It's a much easier conversation, and there's not all this emotion attached to.
Right.
There's not as much emotion attached to the entire process, because we know exactly when those moments come along that the athlete has the chance to work on anything that you see on a regular basis. But in elite skills, it's just like, well, you're doing a pack timer, so just go up, right? Stall as much as you possibly can.
It's a little bit like
you'll do it into a pit. So
it's a little bit like have fun and just enjoy doing it, which also takes them out of their like, I need to be perfect and get this right the first time. You're like, nah, you just need to enjoy the process right now.
Yeah.
And we just need to have a good time.
Go challenge yourself with something you didn't expect, or realize you're even more capable than you expected because you just threw a double layout into the pit, and who would have guessed that was possible?
Yeah, it definitely changes your frame of reference and your perspective on yourself, increases your belief. I want to tap into a little bit before we end this is conditioning and flexibility. You don't have to be super thorough necessarily, but maybe hit the categories of conditioning, the themes, and maybe like how you're able to measure your results, so that builds confidence in your conditioning program.
Yeah, so we did just rebuild a lot of this. So I'll start with the flexibility, since that has changed probably the least in the last few months here, even in the last year really. Problem with flexibility is you go through the stretches and you could have just no idea if the athlete got more flexible unless you had your literal hands on them and you're like, hey, I'm going to make sure you got more flexible. And you have 12 athletes and there's not enough time in the day.
Right. So
I've been more regularly just been focused on, what is your major flexibilities, and having a 3-5 minute time period to say like, hey, who's going to pass this flexibility? That's all we're working on. So you don't have an escape. There's not a like, let's go do something else. It's just, nope, we're on flexibility right now. So if you're super flexible, you get to work on other flexibility, but you're going to get your pancake down. That's it. You're going to have splits, and your bridge, whatever those things are. And we just hit them at least 1 to 2 every day we come into practice. We're about 3 or 5 minutes. Now that's
3 or 5 minutes each
per flexibility thing. So they have 3-5 minutes per, let's just say,
skill.
Flexibility skill to stretch
like
out and try to get it to pass. And really, we know if you spend 5 minutes stretching something, you should be capable of getting to the most flexible you're going to be in that day.
Yep.
If you know what you're doing. And the only reason I can do something like that is because we've gone through, hey, this is how you get more flexible with the girls so many times. You need to actually be actively moving. So you need to be able to squeeze the muscle you're trying to stretch. You need to be able to relax the muscle you're trying to stretch. Here's all the drills or the stretches that you can do in case you're getting stuck at some point. So you have middle splits. Well, we have 6 different ways of stretching middle splits, right? Splits, same thing. There's a bunch of different stretches that they're doing each time they come to that. And so the question is really just which one's going to help you the most for how you feel today, and also for where the athlete's specific lack of flexibility is. So we still do cool down stretches, still do warm-up stretches, all of that.
Right.
But as far as increase in flexibility, you usually just have those moments where you spend a specific time on it.
Well, I think that's a good point. Just what you just said is there's cool down stretches, there's warm-up stretches, but then there's this time allotted for get better flexibility. And that is what we missed, is we would do the stretches, but we weren't really saying you actually have to show improvement.
Yep.
And I really liked how you used to just say, I need to see improvement. And the kid would, and it was like almost any skill, right? The kid would be like, can you watch me, Cooper? And you just be like, did it improve? And they'd be like, I don't know. And you're like, no, I'm not going to watch you until you know it improved.
Yeah.
And then once they're like, yeah, right. And then they'd be like, okay, I improved this. And then you would watch it. And then basically you're just validating like, okay, yes, that improved.
Yeah.
That I feel like changed the stretching game, because now the girls are coming in not just doing flexibility to do flexibility. They're doing it with the mindset of I need to show improvement. So they're not even saying like, well, if my pancake is flat, the question is, can you improve your pancake? And it's like, if you can, do that. The question then is, if there's nothing to improve, what do I do now?
Yep.
And I think that was different, because you'd get a kid who does a pancake, but their knees are rolling forwards or their toes are sickling, it's like, well, you don't even have leg control. Like, we still need to get your legs correct, or your lower back is not actually flat. It's still rounding.
Yeah, now we're very, very picky with it's got to look exactly like that.
Right.
That's it. And they all know that specifically. And again, what are the things they need to do? Or I'll just tell them that, hey, get better at this stretch. It should help out that problem. I'm seeing your knees poking out in the back leg of your split.
Right.
Or, your back leg just in general isn't flexible enough in your split position, so your hip is on your front leg. So any of those problems we can solve in those moments.
Yeah, that's cool. So then go into conditioning.
Yeah, so let's see if I can remember all of it, because it was actually a pretty long conversation we had. We wanted to make the conditioning as similar to how we built the rest of our gymnastics program. So there would be these categories, and obviously they had to make sense for the conditioning side. And we already know there's force, there's speed, there's your tension, and then you need to just increase your volume to build your capacity. So those are kind of the main categories. And then we knew that, well, there's different ways of training all of those things. And then for gymnastics itself, there's some motions and exercises that they just matter more than others. Right. And which ones are you going to be doing regularly. So kind of, I think just going into volume is probably the easiest one to talk about. Is you're going to have, there's two sets of volume. I'm only remembering one at the moment, but one kind of set of volume you're going to be more using as a test to see how hard your athletes work. So it's going to be very base layer exercises that can be very, very easy. But you're basically going, and you're going to see who wins, right? Who just goes the longest, who does the most, or what is the give up point of people. Right. And you're kind of always going to be pushing into that. Not till injury, right? We're not going until like, wow, this person could physically do no more. We're going until this person wants to give up, and then we're going to try to push it a little bit further, because they need to get that emotional side dealt with. And the reason for that is it's going to be correlated to all their skill progressions, all their fear, anything that they want to give up or run away from. It's like, no, you just need to be able to confront it, whether it's a physical problem, emotional, any of that. It's push forward, right? And you'd be able to have that in your conditioning as well. And then I did just remember the other side for our volume is the most directly correlated exercises to the skills you'll be learning.
Right.
And so we hit a high volume of those. And those are more, hey, this is how strong we want to get, and let's see how strong compared to that you are going to be. So if it's 20 horizontal leg lifts, it's, we're doing horizontal leg lifts, and you're going to see what you're capable of today. And then kind of outside of that, we have speed, and I think speed we have shifted a little bit. So there's less total amount of things to do, and as much as possible, we are dealing with rhythm. So can you move quickly? Great, but can you move quickly consistently, or under some sort of changing rhythm? And because gymnastics, like we talked about in the back tumbling, to be able to go upwards, it's like, can you move fast? Wait a second, you have to go down. So I need you to be able to run quickly and then shift up your tempo a little bit, go into a hurdle position, or any other
right, yeah.
timing things that you could do. It's going to be like a 1, 2, 3, wait, 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Yeah.
And now it's going to continue. Tension. You have a couple problems when you are going at max effort, and the body's capability of handling that load actually doesn't start off at the same level. So an athlete could be very, very fast, and yet when they hit the surface, their body can't handle it. And this you see a whole lot more with ex-athletes. A guy I know, a story you've told before, Raleigh, or perhaps it was Brian, is a old Olympian, elite male athlete, was at camp, and he decided to throw a double layout on rod floor. I was like, well, he could do a double layout. That wasn't the problem. The problem is his Achilles couldn't handle that, so he had the injury. So for tension side, we need to make sure that your body can actually handle the amount of load that it's producing. So we have basically what is the hardest position with the most amount of force we can apply safely to that position that an athlete can handle. And then we have just this very, very specific kind of shapes that we would want to have. And was there another side of that I'm forgetting? Because I want to make sure I do accurately cover it.
No, because that's basically what you talked about is the tension that can handle the load, and then there is the tension through the shape change, essentially, which is more like, can you hold the... So in weightlifting, tension is oftentimes used as a transition point between the contracting and the eccentric motion. And so it's like how it's usually like the 90-degree angle is how much force can you handle at the 90-degree angle. And what you do to strengthen that is to get to the shaky point. That's the shaky point in the tension, is you get all the muscle fibers to start shaking, because then neurologically your brain has to recruit more muscle fibers, which then gets it to activate more muscle fibers simultaneously, and then that muscle works in more unison, essentially. It's creating micro-coordination, essentially. So then when you go to change directions in the load, you can actually handle more load when you go to change directions. I believe also it might be when you're doing certain types of strength training, you can create thickness in the muscle wall. And so I think some of it is complementary to creating the thickness in the muscle wall when you're doing that as well, because you're recruiting the muscle fibers, you're putting it under this load, and you're kind of complementing the capacity of the athlete now. Because it's like, if the error would be is, okay, you got really strong muscles, but you can't get all your muscle fibers to work together, not all of them, but the majority of them work together, so you're still going to have weakness. So even if you get this quote-unquote strength in the muscle, it's still not coordinated, they're not working together, so then you're still not using all of it, thus there's still a weakness. And so you're only as strong as your ability to reuse as many muscle fibers as possible.
Yeah. Yes, and so that would more directly correlate in the gymnastics field of, can you keep perfect tension throughout an entire routine? And to understand that keeping perfect tension while moving is extremely difficult and very, very tiring. So you need to, exactly what Raleigh just said, train the neurological side of, can you get your brain to muscle activation stronger so you can activate more muscles, and you will therefore be less tired by the end of the routines. Thank you. So covering that one. I think the only thing left was force. Now, force is pretty simple. You're seeing how much force can you generate, and most of the time it's really upwards is a way you could look at it. How high can you jump? If it's too easy to do off two legs, you're going to do it off of one leg, but it's how quickly can you get off the surface, and then you're also going to have to do something with that height. So can you absorb a lot of impact? And so now we have the lower down to a stop positions, or you're going to do chin up, stop yourself, anything that is going to be using a large muscle group to a stop position.
I want to interject on the stop position, because and maybe somebody out there knows this better than I, but I remember doing some research, and they're talking about where does the hamstring tear on a runner, and it had to do with more of the lengthening of the muscle than actually the contracting of the muscle. And it was because they're moving so fast that as the muscle lengthened, it actually couldn't absorb the amount of force that was coming through the system, and then that's where it would tear. It was counter to what their thought was. They thought it was going to be tearing because it's shortening, but it's actually tearing because it was lengthening, and the hamstring didn't relax fast enough so that there was more force in the system than its ability to relax and dissipate the energy, you could almost say. It's like there's still energy in it, and it was getting pulled apart.
That makes sense.
It wasn't ability to get the energy to move through the muscle and transfer to the other side.
Yeah, so taking on that, there is most definitely a stretch reflex you are dealing with, and if you can look into this a little bit more, but a lot of what you almost need to be able to do is full range of motions through those body parts as much as possible, whether it's like single leg calf raises or it's going to be working your hamstrings or quads. So you're trying to go from full extension to flexion as much as you possibly can, and then be able to increase the load as much as possible. So you're going to deal with heel problems if you don't do that with calf raises. You're going to deal with knee problems if you don't keep, if you're like doing single leg squats, you can go into a stretch position during your single leg squats. And there's different variations of training those as well.
Yeah. Cool. I think that's a pretty good explanation of the conditioning. Any things that you've been able to see, mile markers, because there's all this information for coaches, and then they're like, okay, well, why should I apply any of it? Because how do I know it's even going to work? And what, am I not going to get a return for 3, 6, 9 months? And so it's like, it's not motivating, right? So all the stuff we talked about, I feel like is not really motivating. I oftentimes say, and I think this is true, that if you can't see a result in 2 weeks, it's like it's probably not working. Like you should see at least a result, some aspect, some progress in 2-week measurements. But is there any mile markers that you've been able to see? Like when a person can do this many times, it becomes easier over here, or it usually takes about 2 weeks to go from 7 handstand push-ups to get to 10. Like what are those patterns that you've been recognizing?
Well, that's a tricky one because everyone has a different starting point. So if we're going to take the group that we have that has the most similar starting point, I could say that how we have repped casting on bars has probably been one of the most efficient methods I've seen and the fastest results, because we're just asking, can you hit a perfect cast without coming off the bar 10 times? And we've done that through basically circuiting for me to be able to watch it enough that I think it took 2-3 weeks before all of them were able to put it into their routines. And it was just cool. Like this perfect cast. And I didn't have to teach it or talk about it the same way in the routine work at all. And we had kids who were doing Archie casts just every single time in 2-3 weeks, actually be able to find a perfect shape and again, put it directly into their routine. So that was a huge return on investment from us doing it for 5-7 minutes once a week. It didn't take much time, and yet we didn't have to stress about it where I would normally stress about it without this program existing. And you'll see that in some other areas too. With leaping, I've seen it. Split jump work was a big one. We have all this training going on, and then once a week it's, hey, show me your split jump and how good it is. And we just have kids that you wouldn't necessarily look at their flexibility or how often do they split jump and expect them to just have a flat split jump on floor. And I think we have a couple of 7, 8, 9-year-olds just have flat split jumps on floor or within 5 degrees. Yeah. And I don't know if we've ever had that before, especially looking at where those kids came from 6 months ago. It's been a huge explosion with both focusing on specifically, hey, this is where we're caring about the quality. Okay, here's where we're caring about moving as fast as you possibly can, separating those two cares for split jumping, making sure all the conditioning for the tension, the holds, the flexibility, that whole program, it just shows that it works for the people who put their work into it. And there is multiple other examples.
Can you touch on pressing real fast? Because pressing is an annoying one, and we've done a lot of different things with pressing. I feel like you did a really good job at organizing the pressing information. But I feel like we made there's like some subtle tweaks that happened that all of a sudden it was like we had these huge breakthroughs. And I don't quite remember all the subtle tweaks because I know you work with them more regularly.
So yeah, there's a lot of problems to solve in pressing by itself, and you have flexibility. So having just the standard of get a pancake that's correct was pretty helpful.
Yeah.
And then you have how do you volume pressing work without cheating it when you don't just have a press to handstand.
Yep.
Right. So there's 7,000 different conditioning exercises that you can do, and you can just ask, is the person even able to push up? And a coach might be like, wow, they can't push up, they can't press to handstand. It's like, well, you're probably right, but it's not going to correlate as nicely as what you'd really hope. And so we tried to break down pressing just like we did with kind of everything else. Is like, okay, give me the categories that matter, and let's just do those. So you have kind of the hip motions, right? Your swim through work, you're able to lift your legs, and then we basically created setups that were just impossible to cheat. So can you do like a swim through in a handstand position, flat against a wall? If you're doing a straddle L, you have to hold your legs up at a certain height. We do one that you're seated on a block, you're reaching down for the floor to force the compression position, and then you have to straighten and lift your legs up off the ground. And so all of this is, just going to increase hip mobility, and activation in those positions. But you're going to run into that same problem every step along the way. So shoulders, how do you volume shoulders enough?
Right.
And there's a few that we've come up with that I think are the most ideal, but we used to do like a lot of crawling, which you can do, like backwards crawls in a straddle stand. That volumes it if they don't cheat. You can do lower downs. Usually doesn't volume it enough. So you have to figure out how to be very, very efficient with your lower downs. So I've been doing it from a straddle stand on a double block, and I can just go whoop, and then they just reset, and I can get a high volume into that very quickly. Also just rocking, so getting into a lean position, hold, come back down, do it again, and just working for time. So there's not like a, hey, do 10. 10's not necessarily going to get you a press. So we just need to go for a minute, 2 minutes until you've shown me the effort that your body is capable of right now. All right, now we'll move on. So for the shoulders, it's the lean to holds, it's the lower downs that you can hit a high volume of. You can put your bottom on a wall in a straddle stand and just hold yourself up in a straddle stand with your feet floating. And those were all good ones. And then I think really we just did a lot of stalder rolling because, again, you're looking for high volume and pass or fail, proving if an athlete can do it or not. It's like the most straightforward thing to say, did you get better?
Yeah.
You can stalder roll all the way down the floor. You could probably do a stalder press to handstand at least once.
Right.
So, and all the other things that I just talked about just increase the stalder roll. Just being able to break it into a couple categories of what is your flexibility, what is your range of motion with your hips, what is your shoulder strength into that. And we can do holds for all of those positions as well. I think that was pretty massive in our shoulder rolling, and then eliminating any way that an athlete could really cheat it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
It's a hard one. I understand. A person's like, I want to be done with this. Well,
right.
But you're going to want to have a cast to handstand one day on bars, so we still got to get it.
I think you bringing up the not cheating part is huge because we really tried to do so many different things, and I feel like that's kind of where drills are in a lot of stories, is because the athlete, it's hard to measure if an athlete's putting in 100% effort, and especially if they're not capable, they give up before their give up point. And so I think you go into just some of the conditioning categories you said, where we do volume till they get to their quitting point, and then we get them to do more so that they learn how to push their quitting point further down the road. I think that has helped with the pressing, because we used to do things in pressing where they try to hold a position and support, whether it's a tuck planche hold or a straddle L or something, and it's like they would just give up on their arms when you knew that they could give you like a half second more. And just to get them to believe that like a half second more would improve them, I feel like it took a little while to get buy-in. But once they started realizing, like, if I can just hold it a quarter second longer, I will actually see a massive return on result. because I felt like we hit this plateau where no one was really significantly getting better, and it all came down to your point is like they were all cheating essentially the effort. They were not putting in full effort till failure,
Yeah.
and they were only putting in 98%, and it's like that's not going to get you the press to handstand. Like I need the 100% to the face plant.
Correct.
To like my arms buckled, and I'm like, darn it,
well,
didn't
it's the
work.
joke. It's not really a joke. Where I tell a lot of our girls are like, go until your face feels like it's gonna fall to the ground, and then just go for another 2 seconds. Because when it starts falling to the ground and you're still fighting, okay, you probably worked hard enough at that point.
Yeah.
And obviously, I don't want you to face plant, but you need to feel the, oh shoot, I'm going to face plant, and then you still have to fight.
Right.
Because that's again gonna get all the neurological contraction for your muscles that it could possibly be. That's going to actually allow you next time to maybe push through for that extra next second and make a huge difference. And so, yeah, that is a lot of the conversation when we talk about pressing, which just feels like for so many people this impossible exercise.
Yeah, especially for coaches. I think coaches feel the same way. It's like, how am I ever going to get this?
Yeah.
I know that you get a kid who's just born who can just press, and you're just like, oh, that's really nice. But it's like, how do you train somebody? I think I think one thing we can take a little bit of pride in ourselves is when we started getting those older girls who are like 16, 17,
Yeah.
press to handstands.
That was cool.
And it's like, okay, these girls have never pressed their entire life, basically, and they're going through our pressing program, and all of a sudden it's like, oh.
I think we did it for 3 months.
Yeah.
And there was a girl who could stall the roll probably twice in a row. And that's a decent start. But yeah, she actually started making 3-4 press, like full stalder press to handstands on a daily basis.
Yeah.
When she was really working for it. So that was awesome
that
to
was-
see at 17 years old.
Yeah.
That's
I feel like it's very rare, because you're just like, that's not where it usually starts. You got to get it before, when you're younger, and then you can keep it essentially.
Yeah.
Okay, so then wrapping this up for our listeners, what do you think emotionally have been the changes for you as a coach since you've been coaching under this type of framework compared to in the past? Obviously, you've been mostly following a lot of my programming and stuff, but you've also been coached by other coaches. You as an athlete and being a level 10 gymnast have gone through your own training development. Where does this sit in comparison to how you're comparing it to the rest of your gymnastics experience in the world out there?
Sure. So I think that's tricky without really talking about my experience throughout gymnastics. You know, I was trained by you for a little bit. I went to 2 other gyms as well. We went to numerous training camps and went to a couple international training camps as well. And I feel like, thinking back to a lot of my experiences, it was done very traditionally. Like, this is how the person who, and I was taught actually by a couple of elite coaches, as in they were elite athletes themselves. But it was still very traditional, like, hey, this is how I was taught, so this is how we do it. And that was just passed down without the critical thinking and the actual knowledge implementation from coach to athlete that can be so beneficial. And so I think, coming from what I trained as, I can actually look at our program and realize, oh, wow, okay, this would have solved some of those issues I ran into along the way. And I could be a stubborn athlete. I'm just going to throw that out there. Like, I was very much the kid who would want to just learn the thing because I thought I could. And a lot of times I could, and other times I had not enough understanding of how my body needed to move, or even how to activate the muscles necessary to get the skill to actually work for me. But this breaks it down and separates the time without feeling like it is making the athlete get held back. And that was a big thing for me during the training, is every time we do something similar to what we call basics now, it would be in place of upgrades or of our routine work or anything.
Yeah.
And we just weren't allowed to do it. And that was the most frustrating thing for me as an athlete, where I was like, okay, I'm doing this thing and I hate it, and I didn't understand why I was doing it, because you're not going to be 13, 14 and understand why you're just doing one thing over and over and over again, especially when you haven't been brought up in a culture in a gym that talks about those things on a regular basis. And on top of that, I don't get to do the other things I want to do. It's like, that sucks.
Right.
So this program's so nice because it really covers everything for the athlete. I don't get the emotional pushback when we go to what's conditioning or basics or any of those categories, because the athlete, I feel like, at least trusts, yeah, we'll get to the other things as well at some point, and this is just our time to do that. And then as a coach, this has just been so much more of an emotional relief, because I've found myself less at home or after hours or anything like that wondering, why do I have an athlete that's just not willing to change? Or this one thing the athlete keeps doing, and oh my gosh, that's going to mess us up when we go to competition. Yeah. It's like, now it's just predictable. Now it's like, oh, of course it's going to mess them up when they go to competition. They don't have the prep work for this, or whatever the reason was for. Or, oh no, they're going to do great at competition because I've seen it everywhere. I've seen their effort now. I can tell. And so it's just so much more relief, not having to stress about, did I cover everything? Did I think about, oh, did we do kicking this week? Did we do leaping enough? And just knowing, no, yeah, they have the opportunity. So, it gives them more freedom, but it also gives them more responsibility. And in that sense, it gives the coach a little bit more relief on that side.
I like how you said, did I do enough? Because I remember in a previous system that we were using, you used to do you do a very good job at keeping track of how much time the athletes have spent on all the categories. And you used to be frustrated when you weren't a part of the whole story, because you didn't know if an athlete was missing flexibility on their bridge work, or if they did enough kicking, or if they did enough casting, or whatever it might be. And you're like, I know I hit all the stuff in my event, but I don't know what they're missing on the other events. And you're sitting there going, well, I don't want to have to solve the other events on my event, essentially, right? You're like solving quality on your event.
Why am I stressing about this?
Right, when it's not, the quality's not getting solved on beam or something like that, and you're just like, okay, well, I can't solve bar quality if beam quality is not getting solved, right?
Yeah.
And so you do a really good job at that, and I feel like that's been the coolest thing to see for me, is that now that this framework is in place, we can kind of trust that all the pieces have been covered. We don't have to worry so much, did I get enough or too much or too little? And the other error that seems to happen, what I did with coaching, is you kind of chase the athlete's weaknesses because the thing's glaring you in the face, but you stop progressing their strengths, or you stop increasing their capacity. And so then all of a sudden you're chasing a weakness, and they get better at their weakness, but then all of a sudden they have a new weakness that shows up because you weren't attending to it, because it used to be their strength. And all of a sudden you come back to it and you're like, oh wait, you can't do this anymore. Yep. And then you have to build momentum on that. So
we were constantly adjusting as coaches and be like, hey, what now? Hey, what now? Instead of just trusting the system to be like, they can totally just keep getting better at the thing that they're good at while addressing their weaknesses on a regular basis.
Yes.
And those two things don't have to be so constant at the same time that we're going to see a detriment on both sides.
Right.
So
I like how you brought that up. Cool. Well, thank you for doing this with me. It was kind of fun. I never thought we would talk through the whole entire process to some degree.
You're welcome. That was good.
Yeah. I think next time we should dive into like technique or skill techniques and shapes, and
absolutely
what people, what makes a back handspring actually a productive back handspring, things like that. So do you have any last closing thoughts?
No, I mean, if you ever want to reach out and get more information on this, and let Raleigh Rye know, I'm sure we'll have some sort of contacts in the spot down below. So
yeah,
please do.
Absolutely. Thanks for your time, everyone, and look forward to sending you another podcast video your way in the near future. Bye.
Bye.